Some crimes are so heartbreaking or shocking, they change laws, change society, or even earn the label crime of the century. But the stories that made headlines in decades past aren't necessarily remembered today. I'm Amber Hunt, a journalist and author, and in each episode of this show, I'll examine a case that's maybe lesser known today, but was huge when it happened. This is Crimes of the Centuries. The bottom floor apartment at 10 Rillington Place in Notting Hill had been empty for a few days. No one knew what had happened to the occupants, but the couple who had lived there for years had made it quite clear they were not happy that most of the tenants were black, so their neighbors figured that maybe they had finally just moved away. They had said such awful things over the years and even went so far as to lace the hallways with disinfectant, their way, they said, of keeping the smell at bay. So when the landlord noticed that the couple was gone, he figured the pair had finally moved out, and that was A-okay by him. The landlord, too, was black, a former heavyweight boxing champion named Charles Brown. The couple hadn't been particularly nice to him, what with them being blatantly racist and all. In short, Brown figured, good riddance. Brown was eager to get the now vacant apartment ready for new tenants. He sent another tenant from one of the upstairs rooms into the flat to do some maintenance work.
And when he was cleaning the kitchen, he tried to fix a little shelf to the wall in order to put his transistor radio on it so he could listen to music. And he tore a hole in the wallpaper as he did this and saw that there was a space behind the wall, that it was not solid.
This is author Kate Summerscale, who's going to help tell today's story.
And so he pulled off the wallpaper, pulled away, and saw through a gap in the wood behind it what looked like the body of a woman, a white woman. And he and another tenant then called the police, and that was the beginning of the exposure of all the bodies hidden in the house.
Reporters descended on the place. This is from a March 25th, 1953 story in the Evening Standard. Quote, police tore up lino and floorboards today in the small front room of a ground floor flat at 10 Rillington Place, Notting Hill, where the bodies of 3 women were found walled up last night. And they found a 4th body under the floor. All 4 women had been strangled. All were partly clothed and wrapped in blankets. The search of the flat is continuing. Police were seen passing lino and pieces of boarding through a small back window into the garden, end quote. Now, this was huge news, but I'll note it wasn't front page news. That's only because this case takes place in England, and just a few days earlier, Queen Mary had died. That was the queen who preceded Elizabeth, who went on to reign for 70 years before her own death in 2022. Still, the discovery at Rillington Place wouldn't be relegated to inside pages for long. The more police discovered at the apartment, the more insatiable the public's appetite for the story became. Because after police found those 3 freshly killed women hidden in the wall, and the 4th woman, more decomposed beneath the floorboards, they found the skeletal remains of yet 2 more women buried in the garden. Part of a thigh bone from one of those victims had been out in the open, in plain sight, used to keep a gate propped open like it was some kind of utilitarian device you might pick up at the local hardware store. And we're not done with the body count yet either, because this hadn't been the first time police had investigated a homicide at 10 Rillington Place. A few years earlier, another woman's body had been found in the backyard washhouse alongside her 14-month-old daughter. And in that case, the woman's husband was convicted and hanged for the crime. While police were certain the previous case wasn't connected to the new grisly find, neither the public at large nor the media were certain about that. But that was a question for later. For now, in 1953, in the wake of the discovery of 6 bodies, a more pressing question loomed. Where was the man who had disappeared without warning from 10 Rillington Place? Where was John Reginald Christie? Times of the Centuries is sponsored by Ollie. I have 2 dogs, which now means that Scott has 2 dogs.
And I love those dogs.
Ripley and Ellis, both rescues. They're not well trained. They regularly ruin things we love. They bark us awake at 5 a.m.
On a good day.
But they're amazing. We love them. And they love Ollie, so of course we have to feed them Ollie.
Ollie is clean, fresh nutrition for your dog. You don't have to be a veterinarian nutritionist to know that feeding your dog real, whole foods with minimal processing is one of the best choices you can make for their health.
A perfectly portioned, whole, fresh food diet has been proven to extend your pup's life by 2.5 years. So here's how it works. You fill out Ollie's 30-second quiz, and they'll create a customized meal plan based on your pup's weight, activity level, and other health info.
Ollie crunches the numbers and recommends the right recipes and daily portions for your precious pup based on hundreds of thousands of real dog results. They also have treats and supplements.
Dogs deserve the best, and that means fresh, healthy food. Head to ollie.com/COTC, tell them all about your dog, and use code COTC to get 60% off your welcome kit when you subscribe today. Plus, they offer a happiness guarantee on the first box, so if you're not completely satisfied, you'll get your money back.
That's OLLIE.com/COTC and enter code COTC to get 60% off your first box.
To people who knew him, John Reginald Christie, who most often went by Reg, seemed nothing like the kind of guy who would find himself at the center of a nationwide manhunt. He appeared, in a word, boring. He was a balding and bespectacled man who rarely raised his voice above a whisper.
Reg Christie was a terrifyingly ordinary-seeming, respectable-seeming man. He was a white-collar worker. He was a clerk at a transport company. He was middle-aged. He was 53 at the time the crimes were discovered.
That's Kate Summerscale again. She knows a lot about Reg Christie because she just wrote a book about him that I got an advance copy of to help me research this episode. If you're the reading type, and I hope you are, I highly recommend it. It's called The Peep Show, The Murders at Rillington Place, and it comes out May 6th. In it, she details Christie's early life. Of Scottish descent, he was born April 8, 1899, to parents Ernest Christie and Mary Halliday. They had 7 children, of which Reg was number 6, and the youngest of just 2 boys. Though the family stayed in Halifax during Reg's youth, they had a lot of addresses within it, suggesting Ernest's pay as a skilled artisan didn't quite afford them the stability they may have liked. Still, Ernest was respected in his field. He worked at Crossley & Sons, the largest carpet manufacturer in the world, where he earned the nickname Dr. Christie because he worked as an ambulance steward and was the guy on staff you went to if you needed first aid. Ernest was involved in local politics, serving as a town councilor, and at one point was involved in the local anti-vaccination movement, which I mentioned to point out that we're all stuck in a time loop and nothing ever changes. A bunch of other positions and accolades peppered Ernest's obituary in 1928, but he had a dark side too. Sometimes neighbors heard him screaming at his family. One time, a neighbor said a fearful Mrs. Christie ran into the street to escape him. Mrs. Christie, meanwhile, was a, quote, prominent worker for the conservative cause in Halifax and a leader of the Primrose League movement, end quote. That's according to the Liverpool Daily Post. Around town, the Christie kids were known to be good children. Percy, Reg's older brother, had a knack for numbers and became a bank manager. One of his sisters, Florence, became a school teacher. As for Reg, he left school at age 14 to become an apprentice to a bootmaker, though that didn't last long. By 16, he worked as a cinema projectionist. The next year, in 1916, he joined the army, where he would later say he endured some serious trauma.
In the First World War, he had served as a soldier in France and had suffered from shell shock after being gassed.
Now, this gassing was, as Christie told it, serious business. It happened in 1918 as he worked as a signaler on the Western Front. His job was to carry messages from frontline troops to battalion headquarters. At some point, Christie's regiment was attacked with mustard gas, and he was admitted to a hospital with his eyelids swollen shut and his throat inflamed. He healed from this, but the shell shock Summerscale describes was quite severe. Christie could see, but he was mute. Doctors diagnosed him with functional aphonia, a psychosomatic condition. He was discharged from the military and spent the next 3 years communicating only in writing or by mouthing words to others. Eventually, he regained his voice, but it was little more than a hoarse whisper for the rest of his life. Despite that experience, when the world went at it again, Christie re-enlisted.
And then in the Second World War, he was a police officer in the streets of London during the Blitz. He was rather fastidious, quite a priggish man who told his neighbours off if they broke any rules, such as blackout regulations during the war. And he was highly moral. He disapproved of prostitution and liquor and pubs. He presented himself as sort of educated, high-minded, very proper.
Which is pretty ironic in hindsight because
it was then that he started killing.
Though no one would know that for a couple of decades, so we'll come back to it. In between the 2 world wars, Christie met a woman named Ethel Simpson, who lived near him in Halifax. She was charming and pretty and looking to get married. She was also, by Christie's account, very understanding of his speech difficulties. He once wrote, quote, "I courted my wife with a notebook and pencil, and she became good at lip reading," end quote. She was also a hard worker, getting her first job at age 13. By the time she and Christie married in 1920, she had 2 shorthand diplomas and had attended technical college to boot. The couple lived quietly for the most part. We'll get into the exceptions later. Christie was an amateur photographer and took lots of photos of his wife that he kept in an album. They never had children, though Christie said that wasn't by design. It just never happened. Christie would later say Ethel was an excellent and devoted wife. The 2 had occasional differences that, quote, "never amounted to much," end quote. Now I'm couching all of this for a reason. We only know one side of this story, Christie's side. We don't know Ethel's side. There's good reason for that. Ethel was the woman whose body was buried in the floorboards at 10 Rillington Place. There's good reason to think that the marriage between Reg and Ethel Christie wasn't as picture-perfect as Reg would lead people to believe in his later years. After all, they were married in 1920, and yet, in 1924, Christie moved to London alone, and they would stay separated for 10 whole years. Now, marriages exist in all shapes and forms, so no judgment to couples who love each other but prefer living in separate homes. That's not what this was. They were straight up estranged. And in fact, Ethel fell in love with someone else for several years during their stint apart. Not only that, but Summerscale says that the Ethel during that estrangement was quite a bit different than the Ethel who had been married to Christie.
Ethel was characterized by those who knew her as extremely subservient, meek, under his thumb. She never sort of spoke out against him. But from these letters we have about her love affair when she and Christie were apart, it's evident that she was a woman of very strong passions and they were quelled by Christie. She sort of surrendered to the necessity of having a husband and a home.
Later, after Ethel's body was discovered, reporters would find her lover from years prior. He would explain that he had loved her back and considered marriage, but instead ended things when he pieced together that she couldn't have children. Ethel had been utterly heartbroken, but seeing as she had never sought a divorce from Reg, she had sort of a built-in backup plan. Now, I'm not quite sure what she saw in the guy, because, see, as respectable as he seemed, well, he was in prison when she reconnected with him. It's really tough to explain the depths of the Jekyll-Hyde situation Christie had going on. One neighbor said of him, quote, "He was the most respected person in the street, always in a suit and tie. What a nice man he was, very upstanding character," end quote. And yet, Reg Christie had gotten into trouble with the law a fair bit in his life. Once he was convicted of stealing postal orders. For that he was sent to prison for 3 months. Another time, he was accused of stealing from the cinema where he worked. Then, in 1924, so the same year he and Ethel split, he was convicted of stealing a bicycle. The news brief says the cycle was stolen from outside of a boys' school. Someone matching Christie's description was spotted in the vicinity, and when he was questioned, Christie admitted selling the bike to someone else, though he insisted he hadn't been the one to steal it. He said some other guy he had known in the Royal Air Force had given it to him to sell. Anyway, that story didn't convince anyone, and Reg was sentenced to several months of hard labor. In 1933, he was arrested again, this time for stealing a car. He got another 3 months of hard labor. It was during this incarceration that Ethel reconnected with him. He later credited that reconciliation with setting him straight. He wrote, quote, "It was agreed that the past on both sides should be put behind us. At the visit, she said it was a question of divorce or coming together again. I asked her which she preferred, and she said coming together again. After a couple of weeks, we felt as if we had never been parted." End quote. After that, their life as a married couple resumed and seemed pretty normal, not just by his account, but by the accounts of family members and friends, too. In 1937, the pair moved to 10 Rillington Place. Now, the building itself was nothing special, nor was the road. It was just a small stretch in Notting Hill off St. Mark's Road, lined with 10 houses on each side. The houses, mostly built in the late 1860s, were not in tip-top shape. As Jonathan Oates writes in a book about the case, quote, "The houses in the street were of a dull conformity. The front doors all opened onto the pavement. They had a frontage of 17 feet and were 26 feet long, with a backyard/garden of a further 28 feet. They have been described as dolls' houses due to their small size." End quote. The neighborhood was on a sketchy side, and 10 Rillington Place fit right in. It was described as shabby with flaking paint with, quote, "an ugly Victorian bay window to the front room of the house surrounded by crumbling sandstone." End quote. As the proud owner of a Victorian house with a bay window, I can't imagine one being ugly, but it's clear the house was quite run down. Anyway, that bay-windowed room was the Christie's sitting room. Behind it was their bedroom, and behind that was the backyard and garden. The kitchen, where a fellow tenant would make the grisly discoveries in 1953, was tiny. Each floor of the 3-story building was its own flat. When the Christies moved in, the landlord was a guy named Arthur Partridge, and someone else actually lived in the ground floor unit that the Christies wouldn't occupy until that tenant moved out about a year later. They had coveted that flat because it opened onto the garden where they could sit and have tea and, well, bury bodies, it turned out. The backyard also had access to a wash house, that is, a place to do laundry, plus there was a water closet in there too, though the main building also had a toilet. It doesn't appear Christie loved his home sweet home based on letters he wrote. He once referred to it as, quote, "an unpleasant place," end quote, and made steps to find housing elsewhere. In fairness, he wrote that in December 1949, which was just weeks after a terrible discovery was made in the wash house. From BuzzFeed.
On December 2nd, 1949, the bodies of Beryl and Geraldine Evans were discovered. Beryl was found in the property's shared outhouse, and Geraldine, who had been strangled with a tie, which was still around her neck, was found behind the same building.
Beryl Evans was 19 years old. Her daughter, Geraldine, was just 14 months old. Beryl had also been 16 weeks pregnant with a son. She and her daughter had lived in one of the upstairs flats with Timothy Evans, who was long gone by the time the bodies were discovered. It was clear from the state of decomposition that Beryl and Geraldine had been dead for several weeks. I'm going to go more in depth into this case next episode because it warrants its own look, but for now, know that Timothy Evans confessed, then recanted, then did both again, which did not play well in court. Nor did the defense he ultimately presented, which was that he hadn't killed his wife and daughter, but rather his neighbor did. That neighbor? One John Reginald Christie. After Evans was hanged for the murders, Christie would say he felt people were suspicious of him, though by all accounts, no one outside of Evans' family believed Christie had anything to do with the killings. The newspapers had all reported what Christie had said on the stand at the trial, as well as what his wife Ethel had testified to. She had sobbed over the deaths. Beryl had regularly asked her to watch Geraldine, and Ethel, having always wanted a child of her own, had considered her a sort of godchild. No, the general public didn't suspect Reg Christie of Beryl and Geraldine's deaths. His wife apparently did, but no one would know about that until after she was dead. After the Evans unpleasantness, the owner of 10 Rillington Place tried to sell but had trouble. Go figure. Once a murder's committed in your building, you're likely to be popular with macabre looky-loos and not many others. The owner at the time sublet to Charles Brown, the boxer of color I mentioned earlier, and he recruited a lot of black immigrant tenants who had trouble getting housing elsewhere. The configuration of the building changed. Instead of having 2 flats on the upper floors, Brown rented out each of the 5 rooms to different tenants, charging them £2 per week per room. Reg and Ethel Christie were not pleased with their new neighbors. They complained about them constantly, called them N-words, claimed they stank up the place. They were mortified that some of the men had white girlfriends, too. The horror. The Peep Show author Kate Summerscale suspects all of this hatred was triggered by Christie feeling unfairly put upon in life. He wasn't as popular or as successful as his father had been, and he suffered from what he himself described as sexual difficulties that made him feel inadequate.
Yes, it did seem that Christie and his wife Ethel had their animus for the black tenants of their house and of the neighbourhood more generally was a kind of way of expressing the unease that existed within their marriage and Ethel's suspicions of her husband, for example.
So it's probably no surprise that the women found in and behind 10 Rillington Place in late March 1953 were, Ethel aside, women on society's fringes.
All the suspicion and anger was directed outwards at these people who were on the margins of society. And Christie's antipathy to sexually promiscuous young women, who he characterized as prostitutes, and some of them did sell sex for money, was another instance of this, where he was so kind of high-minded and contemptuous of people who lived outside his moral code. He seemed to see no contradiction between this and the fact he was literally raping and gassing and murdering women.
Christie's first known murder victim came during that spell in World War II when he worked as a policeman. It was then he encountered Ruth First, a tall and slender woman who had been born in Austria. She was half Jewish and smartly fled the country when Nazi Germany annexed Austria in 1938. Sadly, Ruth thought most of her family had died in concentration camps, so when she arrived in Britain as a refugee in 1939, she was a traumatized and lonely young woman. People who knew her described her as intelligent but morose and sullen. She studied nursing for a time and got in trouble on occasion for liking the company of men. She gave birth to a daughter in 1942 when she was just 20 years old and had given the girl up. In 1943, she lived not far from Rillington Place and made the acquaintance of Reg Christie. We don't know for sure what happened between them because no one really looked for Ruth after she disappeared. He would later say she was madly in love with him and pursued a sexual relationship despite knowing he was married, though it's more likely he paid her for sex. Regardless, Christie admitted that while they had sex, he strangled her with a piece of rope. She fought, but lost. He wrapped her body in her coat, stored her beneath the floorboards in a room that Ethel's brother later slept in that very night, and then eventually buried her in the garden. He learned a few things about himself with the murder, he would later say. He found women more beautiful dead than alive, for starters. He could hide murder more easily during war because life was such chaos anyway. And he got a thrill out of killing people. When Christie picked his second victim, he was no longer on the police force. Muriel Eady had a rough start in life. Her mother died in 1918 when she was just 6. That split up the family, with some of her siblings sent to relatives and others sent to poorhouses. In 1944, she worked at Ultra Electron in Acton, where she met Christie, who worked there too. The pair would have tea in the works canteen. She had no idea he decided early on that she would be his next murder victim. Later, he would brag to police that it was, quote, a really clever murder, much cleverer than the first, end quote. He presented himself as someone with medical expertise. In fact, he told lots of people that he routinely performed illegal abortions for women in, quote-unquote, trouble.
Backstreet abortions were a real problem in Britain before and immediately after the war, because abortion was illegal. A lot of young women who found themselves pregnant resorted to these procedures, and they were extremely dangerous. Many young women died or were physically injured by them, and it was a sort of taboo subject.
We'll come back to this later, but regardless of whether Christie actually performed abortions, people definitely believed he did, to such a degree that when bodies were found in his house, people legit said to each other, "Oh, they arrested the abortionist?" This matters because it could explain why Muriel believed Christie when he said he could help her with some sinus issues that had been plaguing her for months. On October 7th, 1944, she had lunch with her aunt, saying as she left, "I shan't be late," then headed to Christie's flat while Ethel was out of town. Christie had fashioned a small gassing device out of a jar as a way to administer what Muriel surely assumed was basic anesthesia. She willingly inhaled from it. Christie had sex with her unconscious body as he strangled the life from her. People who knew Muriel did report her missing, but there wasn't a big to-do made of her disappearance. Her father didn't even know about it until the next year. From that point on, Christie relied on gas and ligatures as his murder weapons, though it would be a while before his next confirmed victims. In the meantime, Christie got himself in a bit of trouble by having an affair with the soldier's wife named Gladys Jones. They had carried on for months until the winter of 1945, when Jones's husband returned home from the war. He heard about the affair through the neighborhood grapevine and beat the holy hell out of Christie, who landed quite a few punches himself. Jones said, quote, "It was a real scrap. Sometimes I was on the floor, sometimes it was Christie. There were no rules. I will say that for him, but I was seeing red. While he was cozy in London and I was overseas, he had broken up my home. It was a terrible homecoming for me, and I paid Christie back in the only way I could. With my fist," end quote. Christie was even roped into the divorce case by being named the third party. We have no documentation of how Ethel had felt about all this. After Muriel's death, Christie was supposedly dormant for 8 years. In between, of course, there were the Evans murders, which is wild to think about. Imagine what might have happened if investigators had at least taken Timothy Evans' accusations against Christie seriously. Maybe they would have noticed that a leg bone was propping up a gate door in the yard. Maybe that would have prompted more digging. Maybe Ruth and Muriel's bodies would have been found. Barring all that, though, there were chances even after the Evans murders for those 2 bodies to be found. The new landlord, Charles Brown, actually wanted to reclaim half of the garden from the Christies, according to Jonathan Oates' book. He wanted to store building materials and dig up the garden to level it. Christie hired a lawyer, Brown backed down. So, of course, the bodies were not found. Not yet. Ethel Christie was the next to die. Her husband killed her in December 1952. The why behind that is murky, even by Christie's own account. He had been sick a lot that year, missing tons of work. We're talking 8 months of the year. He seemed to be constantly visiting his doctor, who said Christie had crying fits, insomnia, headaches, but then he'd suddenly be inexplicably giddy. His doctor said it was a nervous breakdown and prescribed rest and sedatives. Ethel was also sick a lot and nervous. This same doctor gave her daytime sedatives as well as sleeping tablets for night. Now, to outsiders, the Christies largely seemed like a devoted couple. They kept to themselves, unless they were vociferously complaining about their black neighbors, which I admit is a pretty big qualifier. And one neighbor did come forward after the bodies were uncovered to say that one time Ethel told her Reg was mean to her and she didn't know why she stayed with him, but she didn't tell the neighbor exactly what he did to her. Anyway, Christie said the two were as devoted to each other as ever in the weeks leading up to the murder. It's just that he really wanted to start killing women again, and Ethel would surely get in the way of that. So he started swinging by cafes and such to meet young women, and he even brought one of them home at least once. That's according to a neighbor who recalled Mrs. Christie being pretty peeved about the incident. On December 6, 1952, Christie put in notice at his job as an invoice clerk saying he'd been offered new employment elsewhere. He had not. The last time anyone heard from Ethel Christie was 6 days later, on December 12th. No one was alarmed at first because Reg Christie told neighbors she had just taken a little trip. The destination he provided was inconsistent, though. To some, he said she went to see her sister. To others, he said they were moving because he'd gotten a new job and Ethel went ahead to prepare their new home. Of course, all of that was bunk. Christie would later explain that while he technically did the killing, he wasn't the cause of Ethel's death. Not really. He said, quote, "My wife had been suffering a great deal from persecution and assaults from the black people in the house, number 10 Rillington Place, and had to undergo treatment at the doctor's for her nerves. On December 14th, I was awakened at about 8:15 a.m. I think it was my wife moving about in bed. I sat up and saw she appeared to be convulsive. Her face was blue and she was choking. I did what I could to try and restore breathing, but it was hopeless. It appeared too late to call for assistance. That is when I could not bear to see her so. I got a stocking and tied it around her neck to put her to sleep." End quote. How thoughtful. He left the corpse in their bed for a few days, then put it beneath the floorboards. He made a point to explain that it wasn't easy. Sure, Ethel had been beautiful in her youth, but she had gained weight in her later years, her husband explained. She was heavy enough that Christie said he had to half carry and half drag her to her makeshift resting spot. Now, this confession is awfully self-serving all the way around, but there's one tidbit that suggests more than most that this was no mercy killing, but rather a premeditated murder. This is Nicholas Day in an episode of Murder Maps.
2 days before he murdered his wife of 30 years, she'd written a letter to her sister Lily in Sheffield. She asked Christie to post it. Instead, he kept it. With her now dead, Christie put the rest of his plan into action. He changed the date on her letter and posted it off to Sheffield on the 15th.
He also sent Christmas cards in which he claimed Ethel's signature was missing only because her rheumatism had stiffened her fingers. He even talked himself up a bit, saying he was giving her hand massages to help ease the pain. Again, what a guy. After Christie killed his wife, he set about readying to flee Notting Hill while also committing his final murders. He sold most of the furniture in his flat around Christmas, as well as Ethel's wedding ring and gold wristwatch. He also gave tours to women interested in subletting his place, even though he had no authority to sublet. Landlord Charles Brown was more than ready to be rid of the Christies, in part because he could charge new renters a whole lot more than the couple had been paying because their rates were rent-controlled. So yeah, subletters were a no-go. But that wasn't the point, was it? Kathleen Maloney was his first victim of 1953. She'd had a hard life, orphaned by age 3. By age 18, she was dabbling in sex work, which landed her in prison for short stints. A few times she was arrested for most foul language. I would really love to know what prompted that. Some bars banned her because she got a bit vulgar when she drank, which she did often and heavily. It's likely she met Reg Christie at a bar. A friend named Maureen said Christie offered Kathleen money if she would pose nude for him. In fact, Maureen came along and posed as well. Christie posed with Maureen in some of the shots, both of them nude and simulating sex acts. All of this stuck in Maureen's memory, not just because it wasn't every day she posed with a naked guy, but also because he stiffed them on payment. So the few times they spotted him after the photo shoot, Maureen would scream at him. He eventually settled up by buying them drinks instead, then one night left with Kathleen, who was never seen alive again. Christie would later say that she pushed her way into his flat and demanded sex. He said he thought at the time, quote, "All right, if ever a woman deserved to die, you do," end quote. In reality, though, he gassed Kathleen using that homemade device of his and raped her as he strangled her. A few days later, Rita Elizabeth Nelson became Christie's 5th known victim. She'd had legal run-ins for things like stealing a coat from a dry cleaner's and drunken disorderly. She was 6 months pregnant when she was killed. Her mother was terribly worried about her. A month after that, Christie killed Hectorina McLennan, called Ina by her friends. She was considered a happy, albeit untidy, young woman who had given birth to 2 children, likely out of wedlock. I say likely because Ina did present herself as married to one of her children's fathers, but there's no marriage certificate to back that up. That man lived in Burma, and Ina sometimes talked about saving up to join him there. While Kathleen and Rita were known to do sex work, Ina was not. She had never been in trouble with the law at all. One man said she had known Christie peripherally for a while before she died. She had supposedly said of him, quote, "He's a chap I had some trouble with. He gave me an unpleasant time," end quote. Just before her death, Ina spoke to her father on the phone, who wanted her to move back home. She said she would if she couldn't find a place to live. She'd been bouncing around for quite a while, but she had a line on an available flat at 10 Rillington Place. When she came to inspect the flat, she had in tow a man, a married guy named Alexander Baker, who was cheating on his wife with Ina. Christie was put out by her bringing company. Ina said she and Baker had nowhere else to go, so they slept 3 nights in the flat. At some point, Baker left and Ina was supposed to follow. She never did. Christie gassed and killed her. Baker returned looking for her, but Christie said she had left and not come back. He even gave Baker a tour of the flat to prove she wasn't there. Of course, she was there, crammed in an alcove with 2 other dead bodies behind a sheet of wallpaper. After that, Christie hightailed it. Once the bodies were found in his apartment, he became the most wanted man in the nation. The public was eager to help catch him. But there was a problem. He was so ordinary looking that people thought they saw him everywhere. None of those tips panned out. Then finally, Constable Tom Ledger spotted him on March 31st, 1953, staring out onto the River Thames. He was arrested without incident. Just 3 months later,
Christie was tried at the Old Bailey in June 1953, the same month that Queen Elizabeth was crowned at Westminster Abbey. The case lasted most of a week, and it was a huge sensation with celebrities sort of crowding into the courtroom wanting to see him, to witness this massive trial.
Christie pleaded guilty and testified in his own defense that he had been insane at the time of the murders. He confessed to killing all the women whose remains had been found at his place, and even admitted killing Beryl Evans, the neighbor whose husband had been hanged. But authorities insisted Christie wasn't the real culprit in that case. They said their investigation had been beyond reproach, and really, Christie was only confessing to Beryl's death because it made him seem crazier, as though it's a the more the merrier situation when it comes to the insanity defense in murder cases.
But the jury didn't buy it. They declared him guilty of the murder of his wife, Ethel. He was executed in July.
He was never convicted of the other women's deaths because in England at the time, a defendant could only be tried for one murder at a time, and he'd been sentenced to death for a singular conviction. I mean, you can't punish him much more than that, they figured.
As soon as he died, his statue went on display, his wax statue in the Chamber of Horrors, Madame Tussauds. It was a case that wasn't forgotten for a very long time.
Because it was gruesome, yes, but also because after Christie's death, the matter didn't feel resolved. Had Reg Christie really killed Beryl Evans, like he said? Or had Tim Evans been rightly hanged in that case? The truth of this mattered to a lot of people. We'll delve into that in next week's episode. To research this case, I read an advance copy of Kate Summerscale's The Peep Show, The Murders at Rillington Place, and interviewed the author. If you haven't read one of her books yet, do yourself a favor and pick one up. This is a great one, and it's ready for pre-order. The Suspicions of Mr. Witcher is another. We covered that case in Season 2, Episode 3. I also read contemporary news coverage and author Jonathan Oates' John Christie of Rillington Place biography of a serial killer. Crimes of the Centuries is available early and ad-free through Grab Bag Collab. Join us at patreon.com/grabbagcollab to hear not just exclusive content related to this show, but to also get access to several other shows on our profit-sharing network. Unless noted in the citations, this show was researched and written by me, Amber Hunt, and produced by Amanda Rossman and Henry Lavoie. Original music is by Bruce Hunt, Andrew Higley, and occasionally by my son, Hunt Van Ben Scoten. Other music comes from Soundstripe and Epidemic Sound. If you like the show, help us out by rating and reviewing us on Apple Podcasts. For more information or to recommend a case, go to centuriespod.com.